Welcome to the Pastor Thrive podcast with your hosts, Dr. Tim and Terry Steele. We encourage pastors, strengthen ministries, and inspire churches to thrive. This is Pastor Thrive. You don't have to lead alone.
Welcome to the Pastor Thrive podcast. We're so glad you've joined us. We want to be an encouragement to you in ministry. We want you to know that you do not need to lead alone, that there are others out there that want to help you. And we hope that this podcast does that. This week we are we're finishing up our conversation on dealing with ministry and marriage and how couples can stay connected, just not committed during their ministry life. And so I have my wife, Terry, with us, and she's going to introduce our guest.
Thank you, Tim. We are super excited to have Pastor Jason Eddy here with us today. Pastor Jason became a Christian in 1979 and prefers to be known simply as an ordinary guy who trusts Jesus. He has served in pastoral ministry for over 20 years, most recently as a regional director for Pastor in Residence Ministries since 2014, and it's a dual role, executive pastor at Bethel Church in Janesville, Wisconsin as well. Jason is trained in helping churches facilitate spiritual transformation and develop healthy discipleship systems. He regularly comes alongside pastors and their families as they navigate the challenges of church leadership. He and his wife, Stephanie, have been married since 2001, and they share 3 amazing daughters. So thank you, Pastor Jason, for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to have this conversation.
Jason, all the couples, pastors and their wives, people in ministry want to do better in their marriage, not just their ministry. They want their marriage to thrive, but many of them just don't know where to start. They might have come from when they were children, their parents didn't have a good marriage, or maybe they came from a divorce home. So what are some small intentional changes that can make the biggest difference in a ministry marriage?
I think Stephanie would like me to highlight, as Paul says, not that I've already attained all this. I press on. So I think the beauty of my marriage is that Stephanie is stubbornly committed to following Jesus and loving her husband as I am stubbornly committed to loving Jesus and loving my wife. As we think about small steps we could take, the first thing is I would say, let's start with scripture. And the Bible says in Ephesians 5 that for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, will cleave unto his wife, the two will become one flesh. This is a profound mystery, but I'm referring to Christ and the church. It's taken me a long time to really realize that when I'm cleaving to my spouse, I'm representing the gospel relationship between Jesus and the church. And I don't know, in the church, we talk a lot about cleaving as husband and wife. But when Stephanie and I were going through a very difficult ministry transition, we were in a really bad spot. We had a mentor couple say to us, don't forget to cleave to one another. It's free. That's the best thing you can do. And so in our coaching relationships, I often start in 1 Thessalonians 5:23 that said, the God of peace himself will sanctify us completely, spirit, soul, and body. When we talk with couples being intentional about their marriage, and we talk about cleaving, I put those two concepts together. What does it look like to you to cleave in your marriage spiritually? What does it look like to you to cleave relationally in your marriage? What does it look like to you to cleave physically in your marriage? Now, for every couple, it's different. And for me to tell them what I think they should do, that might not work. But if they can talk about each individually, what would a win be like for us to cleave spiritually? That's a real question. I remember my dad sitting with his arm around my mom in church. My mom would play the organ and she'd get done playing and come back and there'd be dad sitting with his arm around his wife in the message. My wife and I don't get that. We don't get to cleave in church that way because I have responsibilities, she has responsibilities. So we need to figure out a different way to cleave spiritually. So those would be simple questions to begin with. What does a win look like for us to cleave spiritually? What does a win look like for us to cleave relationally? What does the men look like for us to cleave physically? And what Stephanie and I have experienced is through the different seasons of ministry and life and parenting is each new season is like a new wave of stress or this wave of grief, and it seems to wash out all of these bridges of connection. And we're like beavers. We're just continually rebuilding these dams of connection or these bridges of connection. And so we may be doing really well cleaving in all three areas. And then something happens. There's this 2-week stretch of ministry that's just so intense. We can't remember which way is up. And then we look at each other and we realize we feel completely disconnected. And what we will do is try to assess where do we feel like we're not cleaving, and let's get back across that bridge. And if all three are washed out for some reason, what's the first one we can get back across? And then once we get back across one, let's rebuild the other two. So that would be where I would start, is just asking, where do you feel like you're cleaving well, and what is missing, and what would be a step we could take to begin rebuilding that bridge?
So the communication then needs to be constant and open, and then the actions flexible, right? Because ministry changes. Anybody who's been in ministry knows that. It's the ebbs and flows and the unexpected things that come along there. How can couples set healthy boundaries, right? Whether it's a boundary inside their home or inside the church or with the church, without feeling guilty or selfish about that?
Well, I'm a recovering perfectionistic people pleaser. It's very hard for me to figure out what I need. And likewise, then it's hard for me to figure out what my marriage needs. And it really wasn't until I realized that Galatians 5 teaches that my marriage is my first ministry. The best work of evangelism I do is cleaving to my wife. Now it becomes, and maybe this is just my brain, but if it's marriage or ministry, that's very confusing to me. When marriage is part of the ministry, I'm very focused in it. And so in order for me to feel like I can set healthy boundaries, I need to feel like it's part of my call, because I need to preserve the call God has given to me. And God has first called me to be his son, and then he's called me to be Stephanie's husband. And then he's called me to be a dad. And then he's called me to be a pastor. And if I get those things in the right order, it's going to work. But if I don't get them in the right order, even if I put my marriage first, if I put my marriage ahead of being God's son and his disciple, my marriage isn't going to work well either. So I've got to get them in the right order. And once I get them in the right order, then I feel like I have permission to get the boundaries in the right place.
Can I add one more question to that then? Oftentimes, churches who have hired a pastor think that the church then, and that role and that calling, jumps to the top of that list. So how does a pastor articulate that to his leadership and his board and his church, if that's the tower of blocks, the way that you believe they should be set? And I agree with you. How do you communicate that to the church who thinks we hired you to be our pastor? That should be your number one priority.
Cooper and Joe Briscoe have had a profound impact on Stephanie and me. And they were the ones that really introduced the idea to us that those of us in spiritual ministry have two families. We have our biological family, our marriage, our kids, and we have a spiritual family. And parenting two families at the same time is complex. And what I would say is I'm trying to figure out where the boundaries are in the right place. There's the, first of all, setting them in the right place. And then there's the communicating about where the boundaries are. And I've never found it helpful. And I would say most family members would relate to this. I've never found it helpful to communicate to my wife or kids that the spiritual family is more important than our biological family. But in the same way, I've never found it helpful for my spiritual family to feel like my biological family is more important to them. I'm parenting two families. And so getting the boundaries in the right place is the first need. But then the second need is communicating that in a way that each family member feels cherished and loved. The church needs to feel cherished and loved by their under shepherds. My wife and kids need to feel loved by their husband and dad and cherished and delighted in. And the way I communicate the boundaries that I need to set and stewarding both of those families, it goes a long way in helping get those boundaries in the right place. That nobody in my church wants my wife to be neglected. Nobody in my church wants my kids to cry because their dad's not there. None of them want that. But when they're in crisis, they also don't want to hear someone's more important to them. They want to be cherished in those places where they need. And so the communicating that both families are cherished and loved and are going to have what they need. There's some times where I may make sure that my child has another ride home. If I can't be there, I'm going to make sure they have what they need. And I think for vocational ministry, there's times where I can't meet the need, but it's very appropriate for me to make sure someone else can meet the need so that the spiritual family has what they need too.
So let's talk about, we all know that there needs to be boundaries, and yet a pastor's messed up on his boundaries. And so his spouse has gotten to the point where they resent the church, they resent the spiritual family, or the pastor resents the spiritual family. What do you do then?
We talked a little bit in the previous episode about having space to talk through why we feel resentment or why it isn't. But the next step of that is having real honest conversations about where are the boundary lines. I learned this the hard way through my own burnout. My health completely failed. And I'll just give you a couple simple things. There's 168 hours in a week. If you divide that by 3, it's 56. And let's put 3 big containers of sleep, home and family, and then work. So I don't know that we can have healthy marriages and families if we're working over 56 hours a week. We've got to keep that piece, because as soon as we start doing something too much, something else suffers. And the problem is we can't see what's suffering when we're doing something too much. I learned in my own health, I can't work more than I sleep. Otherwise, I really start having health problems. The other piece of that is juggling home and hobby. Now, I was raised by godly men who their wife and kids were their hobby. I was blessed to have a dad when he was not at work and he was doing fun stuff with us. And as I see a breakdown of the family, for many of us, it's not been modeled for us how to take vacation. It's not been modeled for us how to have a weekend. A mentor said to me, not only should you have a Sabbath every week, but you should have a new moon Sabbath or a 2-day weekend every month. It's not vacation. I can tell you that is so hard to get in the calendar. It's hard. But I grew up in a home where we had weekends. I couldn't wait for my dad to get off work on Friday afternoons because we were going to the lake to boat all weekend. My kids have never had that. They've grown up in a pastor's home where I get 1 day off a week. But to find those spaces where I can carve out 2 days to do something fun with my kids, that's really important. Now, that was modeled for me in my family of origin, but I think for many of us who went into ministry, if healthy work, home, responsibility, vacation rhythms, if those weren't modeled for us, it's even harder to try to figure them out in a ministry context.
For the couples who, let's say they've had the struggles, they're setting their boundaries, they're communicating, there's been an imbalance, let's say, between all the buckets that you've talked about. What moment do you think becomes the turning point, right? For couples who say, I'm going to fight for my marriage. Let's say there's the possibility the marriage could fail at this point, right? What does that moment look like when they're like, no, we're sticking it out. We're going to fight for our marriage. Tell us a little bit about ones you've counseled with where they've decided to stick it out and what it looks like going forward.
I think one of 2 things happen. Either the pain of staying the same becomes so great that the pain of change seems possible. That's one place where change begins to happen. The other place is when we suddenly get a vision of God's preferred future for us that seems attainable. And that's being around people of faith that can help us. That's one of the values of coaching. When a coach starts asking you, what is your vision of the preferred future? I think for many of us in vocational ministry, we live with some level of frustration that we're not where we want to be in our marriage, or we're not where we want to be as a parent. Like I think there's a little underlying frustration for all of us that we feel like the ministry has to come first. And when a coach sits down with us and says, what if you could live with the same intentional planning for your household that you do in the ministry? What would that look like? What if the ministry didn't have to suffer that much if you were just more intentional? And all of a sudden we begin to see a vision of a preferred future, and we think, oh, I really want that. I really want to work at that. But for me, when I'm not at work, sometimes I'm so exhausted, I'm not thinking through what could be really great for my marriage or my parenting. And that's why I value coaching, because sometimes I need someone to ask me that to help me think through it.
How could pastors model redemption, or how they're keeping their marriage within boundaries and things that are going very well without oversharing from the pulpit? We have a tendency of giving too much information. How do we not do that from the pulpit? And yet we're excited that our marriage is turning around and starting to flourish.
I asked my wife once just maybe how I was perceived, and this is what she said. She says, pastors are always expected to be right. So they're always telling everybody how right they are. And so I've been cheering on that in my life, but I think we should start with Paul's example in 1 Timothy 1:15. I think he said, here's a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. I think as leaders, if we can model that in our marriages and in our parenting and in the church, if we can approach these things, that the reality is that I'm the biggest sinner in the room. The reality is my sin today has offended the holiness of Christ more than my spouse's sin has offended me. We can have some healthy relationships. And if we take that, then how do we share this in the pulpit? I would say this. As a pastor, I can share my own shortcomings and the way my spouse has shown me grace with her permission. Those are the stories I can share. It's not my story to share my spouse's shortcomings and how I've shown her grace. So if we share stories, this is where authentic transformation happens. Here's how I have fallen short in my marriage. Here's the grace my spouse has shown me. And here's how God has used this to build a healthier marriage. With my spouse's permission, I can share that. I think the same is true in our parenting. I've had times where I've asked my children, can I share this story of how I fell short and how me asking your forgiveness and how we reconciled and how this built our relationship stronger? Is it okay if I share that? And they'll say, yeah, you can. So those are the stories I can share. I can't share about my spouse or my children and their shortcomings. That's their story to share. That's their testimony. And if they don't want to share it, they don't have to. I only can share my testimony.
That makes sense. It's a nice boundary to have, right? The permission to share versus, because I've seen situations where pastors have gotten up, and I know the pastor's wife, pastors have gotten up and told a story. And in my head, I've thought, ooh, I wonder if he ran that by her before he got up there and overshared the things that could potentially be embarrassing. If I was a woman and it was my story, I'm like, I'd want you to share that. So I think that's important, right? That permission to share. I think it makes them feel valued and seen in those kind of scenarios. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about, now that we've got people, they're connected, they're committed, they've gotten their boundaries in place and they're moving forward, right? That hopeful situation. Let's talk about some ways they can avoid the failures or prevention, right? How they can protect now, where they've potentially gotten into that, back into that good space. Part of that is detecting early warning signs, right? So if in a marriage, what are some early warning signs that might suggest they're drifting away or there's an imbalance due to ministry pressures?
I highlight a story that is in a book. It's actually written by the executive director of PIR, Sean Nemechek, wrote a book called The Weary Leader's Guide to Burnout. And he shares a story of Centralia, Pennsylvania. There's a city ordinance that they were not supposed to do any burning in the city landfill. And they went around the ordinance and tried to burn off some of the top for a city function they were going to have. And unfortunately, not only did it keep going, but it burned down and it caught on the coal under the city on fire. It ended up burning down the whole city. And I think, lays vacant to this day. What I learned about my own burnout is that there's a fire burning down in me long before anybody knows about it. And that's what happens in our marriage, in my marriage, is I may be frustrated with my spouse without ever telling her or anybody. I'm just stuffing it, or I'm just trying to manage it myself. I don't want to talk about it. And that's really dangerous. And the first thing I would say as someone who's recovered from burnout is it's demanding energy from you. You don't have energy to spare. So I've learned literally to say to myself, Jason, you do not have the emotional energy today to continue to be upset about that. So the first sign is that we're beginning to carry frustrations with one another. Proverb 5 says that we are blessed when we rejoice in our spouse. And when something is preventing us from being able to rejoice, then we're beginning to lose blessings. And we're going to know that individually, probably far before our spouse does.
Let's end with some hope here, Jason. What does a successful marriage look like for a couple serving in ministry? We're not talking about perfection. We're talking about being healthy. What does that look like for a couple serving in ministry?
I'll give you, I think, 3 keys to relational success. They're very simple instruction from Scripture that we overlook. The first is give thanks in all circumstances. I wrote into our vows that we would give thanks for each other every day. And I have to tell you, I have had to ask God for forgiveness many times on days I've not given thanks for my spouse. So the first is to give thanks for our spouse. My wife is God's gift to me. She's evidence of God's favor in my life. She's a reminder every day of the gospel relationship that Jesus gave his life to cleave unto me. And I need to stay in a place where I'm thankful for my spouse. The second is to encourage one another every day. Hebrews 3:13, I think. We all need encouragement. And me giving thanks for my wife and encouraging her has nothing to do with her or what she's done. It has to do with me being God's son and his disciple. This is what he's asked me to do, regardless of what's happening in my life. And I find that when I thank Stephanie for something she's done in the day, when I take a moment to encourage her, God was very intentional about that plan. And it's a blessing not only for her, but I'm blessed by doing those things. Praying together is another one. Just praying together every day. I think it's a spiritual battle. The enemy is okay with me praying in front of hundreds of people with a microphone. But when the thought comes that my wife and I should pray together, why can't I get over that hurdle? And I think the prayer that Stephanie and I shared together is far more important than any public prayer I ever offer. And that's taken me a long place to get to. But I think those are some key things. And then the fourth thing would be to ask each other questions each day about how you're doing. If I give my wife the opportunity to be known, what I'm doing is I'm giving her the same gift that God has given me. He says I'm known by him. When I talk to him in prayer, I can be completely known by him. And he wants me to give my spouse the same gift that he's given to me. And so I think those 4 very simple things really can change the temperature and the tone of our marriages.
That's awesome. This has been great. Marriage and ministry isn't about escaping pressure. It's about learning how to stay united through that pressure. And Jason, we are so thankful that you have been our guest for this episode and our last one. And we appreciate what you're doing and all the pastors you've helped. And we appreciate you helping our audience also. We just want to say again, thank you to Pastor Jason Eddy for being our guest today. I appreciate my wife being my co-host. And we always want to say we appreciate Kevin Norris, our producer, who makes us look good and sound as good as possible. Again, we hope you enjoyed this week's podcast. We hope you join us for our next one. Please subscribe to the Pastor Thrive podcast And just remember, you do not have to lead alone. We'll see you in our next episode.
Thanks for joining us on the Pastor Thrive podcast. Keep leading with courage, keep serving with joy, and remember, you don't walk this road alone.